Buying real estate in New York City is a completely different process than buying real estate in almost any other market. It can be very complicated, and trust me, I've had very seasoned buyers come to New York City and be like, what the, I have to do what? It's a very different process. So in this video, I'm going to break it down into very easy to understand steps of buying. And if you stick around until the end of this video, I'm going to tell you how to get access to my exclusive buyer's tip sheet that has all of these steps, as well as a lot more information that you may need to know if you're considering buying in New York City. But first, I'm Dewey. I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button so that you can stay up to date on all things New York real estate. And let's get started. As I mentioned before, many people have bought in other markets and they come to New York City expecting to treat the market in the same way. And that's the first mistake that buyers make. You do not want to treat New York City the same because our buying process is completely different. We have different qualifications because of our co-op and condo structure in our buildings, and we have very different considerations. Those are all topics that we'll talk about another time, but in terms of the buying process, most of the time people are used to making an offer, signing a contract, putting some earnest money down to take the house off the market, and then you negotiate, you have an inspection, you see what's wrong with the house. You probably are familiar with these steps. Those steps do not apply in New York City. So let's break it down and let's take it step by step and talk about what happens when you're ready to buy something in New York City. Of course, hopefully you're working with a really great buyer's agent in New York City that will help you develop a strategy and help you understand what your qualifications are to buy in certain buildings, whether that be a co-op or a condo or buying a townhome in New York City. But let's assume you've done all that, you've made the search, and you have found the perfect dream apartment in New York City. And now it's time for you to make an offer. I often say that offers are like water. They can just trickle through our fingers because they are not binding in the least. You are not making an offer and then immediately signing a contract. Now, pricing and buying is very data-driven in New York City. So hopefully, again, you're working with someone who can help you strategize and create the right kind of offer. But you must be aware that you're not just giving a verbal offer and you're not just giving an offer on paper. What you're doing is creating a little package to present to the seller. Now, if you're buying a co-op, you must present a certain level of financials and disclosures that will allow them to determine whether or not you're qualified to buy in the building. You're buying shares in a co-op, not real property. So therefore, the board has approval over whether or not they will allow you to become a shareholder in that building. So you, in effect, must prove upfront with the offer that you meet the right criteria to be able to buy in that building. If you're buying a condo, that's a bit of a different process. You're still making an offer, but you do have to provide less paperwork. Generally speaking, condos are real property, so they don't care so much about your financials. What they care about is, do you have the money or are pre-approved to purchase the condo? I have a number of videos on this channel that go into depth about the differences between co-ops and condos and townhomes and how you purchase them. I would advise you to go and take a look at some of those videos. But for the purposes of this video, just know that when you're making an offer, it's gonna need to be a complete offer with some paperwork involved to make sure that the seller and their agent can vet you and make sure that you meet the qualifications of whatever kind of property and whichever building you are wanting to buy into. So you've made the offer, the seller likes the offer, you may go back and forth with some negotiations there in terms of the price. You may go back and forth with exclusions or inclusions. In other words, you love that lighting fixture, you want to make sure that it's included, or maybe your seller has some exclusions, some bookshelves or something that they want to take with them. All of that gets worked out here at this point. We do not haggle about that later, or should I say, we shouldn't haggle about that later if we're doing a nice clean deal. Whenever an offer is accepted and all the terms are arrived at, then the agents submit what's called a transaction sheet. sheet or a deal sheet to the respective attorneys. Now, New York is an attorney state, which means you must have an attorney that represents your side and the seller must have an attorney that represents their side. They take care of all of the contracts. Agents in New York City do not touch contracts. We do not compose contracts. We have nothing to do with that. That becomes a legal matter. We do, however, do all the negotiations for you, and we put those terms in that transaction sheet and we send it to the respective attorneys. Now, in other markets, it's often customary to take the house or whatever you're buying off the market by writing a check for some kind of earnest money at this point. We do not do that in New York City when it comes to buying co-ops or condos or townhomes. There is nothing that is binding about an offer at this point. You're not putting down any earnest money, and indeed the selling agent can continue to show the apartment and may continue to get other offers that the seller could accept at this point in time. An offer in New York City is simply that, an offer. Once the attorneys have received the transaction sheet or the deal sheet as we call it, then they go into what's called the due diligence period. Now, the due diligence period really is on the buyer's attorney's side. The agent for the seller or the seller's attorney is going to give a whole lot of information to the buyer attorney about the building and about the specific unit, if anything is known about that unit. That's going to include the building's operating agreements, their financials. Usually we get 2 years of financials, the board's meeting minutes, the house rules, everything and anything that you would need to know about the building comes in due diligence. And in fact, the buyer's attorney often has a questionnaire, a longer questionnaire about the building, and tries to get as much information as they can so that they can determine if there are any red flags about the building. There may be all sorts of things that the agent didn't know. Perhaps there are planned assessments and planned major repairs coming up on the building, and perhaps your maintenance is scheduled to go up another 3 or 4%. These are all things that you would know before you sign anything. Again, I've said offers are like water, they just kind of trickle through your fingers. Well, here's why. If a buyer doesn't like what they're seeing during the due diligence period, or if their buyer's agent and attorney start seeing issues during the due diligence, then you simply back out of the offer. There's nothing really lost other than some time and the fact that you've hired an attorney, but that attorney is going to continue working with you going forward. You don't have to commit to anything once you've made an offer. Now, assuming that everything's going well during the due diligence period, the attorneys are also going to be drafting the contract, and that's going to go back and forth with some red lines, and they're going to talk about that and they're going to negotiate some terms. Then it's going to come to you to review as a buyer, and you're going to take a look at that and get back to your attorney with any changes or any concerns you may have. Eventually we'll arrive at a final contract, and if the due diligence all looks good, then we're ready to go into contract. So I happen to think this is a very good process in New York City because you get a lot of information about the building up front before you enter a contract and you've done all the negotiations. Once you sign the contract, our contracts in New York City are a little bit more binding than they are in other markets. As I mentioned before, oftentimes in other markets, you'll sign the contract, but then you'll haggle a lot and you'll have the inspection and you'll have the appraisal, and maybe you're going to change a lot of things about the contract. That usually doesn't happen in New York City. Once we sign the contract, there is a clause in most every contract that is the as-is clause, and that means something very different in New York City. It basically means what you have seen, the condition that the apartment is in, is what you are buying. There are some provisions in that. You must have working appliances, you must have working water, you must have working air conditioning and heating if that's included in the apartment. But once you sign the contract, it becomes much more difficult to get out of the contract than it does in other markets. And to boot, here's where a deposit comes. You're putting 10% down of the purchase price once you sign a contract to make the contract valid. So if anything does happen moving forward to this contract, there is a risk to the buyer that you would lose that deposit. If you're buying something for $900,000, that 10% deposit is actually worth something. It's worth a lot more, and it's a lot more of a risk to try to get out of the contract than, say, the $1,500 of earnest money. The trade-off is that you've been through the due diligence period and that you can be more assured of what you're purchasing because you have a lot more information that you've now learned about the building up front before you sign the contract. So just a reminder, stick around until the end of this video because I'm going to give you access to my exclusive buyer tip sheet. So if you're watching all of this and you're saying, Dewey, this still sounds incredibly complicated, trust me, this tip sheet will help you out, list all of the phases of buying in New York City, and it's well worth having. So stick around until the end of the video. So now we've got a signed contract, and that is great. We now consider that we have a deal. We have a real deal that's moving forward. Up until then, as I've said, nothing is set in stone and nothing is binding. But once we sign the contract, we have a real deal. For the buyer, however, the process has just begun because if you're buying either a co-op or a condo, you are going to be doing a board application. Now, an application sounds like maybe just a couple of pages that you have to fill out. That is not the case. These applications are extensive financial applications with reference letters, bank letters, financial statements, revealing just about everything and anything that a co-op board wants to know about you as a potential shareholder. There's often a mistake in thinking that if you're buying a condo that you don't have to deal with a board. That is not true. There is still a board of a condo and there is still an application. However, the approval process is different between the two types of buildings. So let's take a co-op for an example first. Once you have the signed contract, you're going to have a certain amount of days to complete the board application. As I mentioned, these application packages are extensive. They can equal something like 1,000 pages at times once you upload all of your statements and your accounts and your stocks and reference letters and everything that the board may require. You're going to need someone good working you through all of this because it can be very confusing and there's lots of ins and outs. There's certain ways to format these packages that really only a solid, good buyer's broker is going to know how to do for you. Once the board application is completed, the property manager of the building is going to review that first and send back any changes that they're going to require, or if you've missed something or haven't done something properly, they're going to send it back and ask for revisions. But let's assume now that the property manager has given a thumbs up. That application then is passed on to the board. Now, at the same time that you're doing your board application, one of the requirements of the board application is going to be a final commitment letter from your mortgage company if you're financing. If you're paying cash, the process will go a little bit differently. But in a contract, you normally have a certain amount of days to get your financing and then a certain amount of days to submit the application after your financing is complete. So obviously you want to be working on the board application and get that in really good shape so that all you're waiting on is the mortgage process. They are two separate processes, but they take place simultaneously. So once you've got your commitment letter, assuming that you are financing, you include that in your board application and you send that off. The property manager of the building is going to review that first, and they're going to look for any kinds of errors, and they're going to send it back if there are any and ask for revisions. We will then change that and revise that according to whatever they want to see and send it back to them. Assuming that the property manager then gives the thumbs up, it's going to be passed on to the board for their review. Now, some boards review things very quickly. Perhaps they talk to each other via email, or they call one another and discuss the applications, or they just have specific people on the board that are responsible for reviewing the applications. Some boards, however, only review applications as a group and only review them at their monthly meetings. So unfortunately, if you submitted the board application a day after their monthly meeting, you're going to have to wait another month before that board reviews your application. Now, assuming that the board finds the application in order, they then grant an interview. Sometimes interviews take place via Zoom, sometimes they're in person, so you're going to have to be prepared for that interview. Interviews with boards are rarely roll out the red carpet and here's some milk and cookies and welcome to the community. Very rarely are they that way. They can take many different forms. Some boards are really going to dig hard into the application, ask you lots of questions because they're making sure that you are going to be a good shareholder coming into the corporation. Some boards may take a lighter approach. They may only be going over the house rules because they've reviewed your application and find all the details in the application to be in order. And maybe they just want to make sure that you understand the rules of the building so that they can continue to create a good community of shareholders that are going to abide by all the rules. So a good buyer's agent is also going to help you prepare for this interview. They're going to give you some tips and things to be on the lookout for and hopefully help you ace your interview. Assuming the interview goes well and everything is in order, then the board will issue their approval and send that to the property manager, and then the property manager will get in touch with everyone and let the buyer know and their attorney and their agent that they have been approved, and then we can finalize the process and move to closing. So believe it or not, closings do look very similar to closings in other markets. You're going to finalize your financing. The bank is going to set a time with your attorney and the seller attorney to do the closing. Our closings are in person unless you have assigned a power of attorney. So you are going to need to be there. You'll sign all the paperwork, all the funds will be exchanged, and then you are a proud owner of either shares in a co-op or real property with a condo. Now let's go back to the difference here between a condo. You have made an offer, you've had the offer accepted, you've gone through the due diligence, all of those steps are the same. You've gotten the contract signed. Now you're going to do the board application for the condo board. Now the application can take on many forms. It may be as extensive as a co-op application. It may be a little bit simpler, but the process of the approval is different because with a condo, you're buying real property, which means that the board cannot actually approve you to buy. What they do is offer what's called a right of first refusal on the unit, which means that they don't want to buy the unit for the same price that you have offered to pay for it. I don't really know of any condo that has ever really wanted to buy their own apartments. They generally want them to sell and move on to people who are going to own them. So it's more of a formality with a condo than it is for a co-op. Now, if a condo board does see something that's wrong with the application, perhaps you've lied on the application. I hope you certainly don't do that, but perhaps you have, state that you don't have a criminal background, perhaps something comes up in a criminal background check, or your credit is something other than you've said it is. If there's some sort of dishonest factor about the application, the board does have the right not to issue the waiver of first refusal. But generally speaking, condo boards issue that, and then there is no interview. Again, you're buying real property, so they're not approving you to come into the corporation as a shareholder. They're merely saying, we don't want to buy this property, so we're going to issue the waiver of first refusal, and then you get to move to closing. In some ways, a condo is an easier and faster purchase than a co-op. But again, I would advise you to look at some of the other videos that we've had that show the differences between co-ops and condos, the difference between the two economically, and the reasons why you may buy one or the other property depending on what's right for you. And just like with a co-op, the closings for a condo look very similar to closings in any other market. Now that whole process from the time that you've signed a contract to the time that you've closed, this is not including the negotiation and the due diligence period. This is talking strictly from the time you've signed a contract and the deal has become real to the moment that you're at the closing table. A rough time frame for all of that for a co-op is usually about 3 months, especially if you're financing. Financing will take anywhere from 30 to 45 days. So you need to allow yourself 3 months to be able to close on a co-op. If the board moves slowly, unfortunately, it could take a little bit longer. If it's an all cash purchase, it could take a little less time. So 3 months is an estimate, but in general, it takes about that length of time to get to the closing table. For a condo, we generally say 2 months, even if you are financing, and that's because we're not really waiting on a board and an interview and the board approval for you to buy. We're just waiting on that waiver of first refusal. So generally we say 2 months. It can be faster, of course, if you're paying cash. So a final review of all the steps in a very simplified form. You make an offer. The offer is accepted. You go through due diligence diligence, you sign a contract, you do your board applications, you receive some sort of approval or waiver, and then you move to closing. During your board application, you will simultaneously be working on your mortgage and financing if you're doing that. So as promised, I'm going to give you access to my exclusive buyer's tip guide. Just use the QR code on the screen or visit this link and you'll be able to get access to that. And then we can certainly schedule a call to go over all of these processes and how I can help you buy as painlessly as possible in New York City. As always, I'm Dewey Moss. I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you can stay up to date on all things New York City real estate. And I'll see you next time.